everybody. Welcome back to the Red Web, where we talk about superhero culture and media. I'm Brad West, your host, one of your hosts. Of course, the lovely Anastasia Anderson is here, helping, as always, to lend a little bit of air of beauty to the set. My partner in crime fighting, Mr. Greg Burrow, who is here on behalf of our wonderful partners over at Dragging Their Comic Fantasy on Anderson Lane here in Austin, Texas. And a special guest today is my very dapper friend, educated and worldly Mr. Daniel Griego. He's really, really good at discussing like literature and philosophy. And so we thought we would have him here help us discuss the topic of metafiction. Metafiction is the topic of today. When we were researching it, we came up with a lot more than any of us were really expecting to find. So it's going to fill more than just one show. But to just real quickly go over the Wikipedia definition, for those of you who are not aware, metafiction is a form of fiction that emphasizes its own constructedness and continually reminds the reader to be aware that they are reading or viewing a work of fiction. So basically it's the idea that you're reminded that instead of just the pure escapism of a story, you're reminded that you are, in fact, viewing or participating on the outside of a story. The main one that we're going to talk about today is breaking the fourth wall, and we'll explain that a little bit in a minute. But Daniel had some really good points on just like some basic groundwork for metafiction. Do you want to share that with us?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much, Brad. So when I think of meta, and I don't want to just confine it, metafiction, but just meta as a term, it has a lot of connotations associated to it. And for me, it really goes back to a sense of self-reflection, a sense of acknowledging its context. So it's not just a giant, massive concept of, Cabin in the Woods is meta because it makes fun of all the horror movies. It's not. It doesn't always have to be that grandiose. It can be small, instantaneous moments, like Terminator 3, Arnold Schwarzenegger putting on the stripper glasses with the stars. That was meta because it was calling back to the same parallel scene in Terminator 2 where he put on the legitimate sunglasses. And, the same concept where Kyle Reese in Terminator 1 and Arnold Schwarzenegger in Terminator 2 both said, "Come with me if you want to live." Those are instantaneous moments of meta. And for me, that's really my big moment, because it's not necessarily breaking the fourth wall, but it is recognizing within its own internal universe callbacks and consistencies that the viewer is like, I see what you did there.
Yeah. Yeah, I know that one of the ones we talked about that got me to remember to think of you for this episode is when we were talking about the Blair Witch Project, and how the sequel to the Blair Witch Project acknowledges the original Blair Witch Project as being a work of fiction.
Right, yes. And it cracks me up because I'm only aware of 3 instances in movie history where a sequel acknowledges the predecessor as a movie, and weirdly, all 3 instances are in the horror genre.
Yes.
There's Blair Witch 2, Book of Shadows, which acknowledges the first one as a movie. There's Human Centipede 2 that recognizes the first Human Centipede as a movie. Yes. And then who can name the third one?
You named the one I knew.
Okay, yeah.
So the third one is the 7th or 8th
Nightmare on Elm Street movie. Yes. Oh my gosh, yes. That's a really good one.
New Nightmare.
Yeah.
And it
Wes
was
Craven's New Nightmare. Yes.
Which was brilliant.
I was thinking of Scream.
No.
Yeah. Scream was never recognized as a movie, but they had movies within it.
Yeah.
That's kind of in a way, yeah, because in like one of the later Screams.
Yeah, not necessarily the first one, but following them, they were like, but this wasn't real, right?
Yeah.
Right. Exactly. Okay. Yeah. So yeah, in a way, would that count? Like, would the Stab movie within the Scream universe count?
It's kind of splitting hairs at that point.
I mean, yeah, it's meta, but in a really gratuitous, lazy way.
Yeah.
Okay. It's already a movie about horror movies, and you put a movie inside the movie about horror movies, and at some point it's just beating itself over the head. And like, it was cute, it was campy, it was fun. But it wasn't like, I mean, obviously Scream was never meant to be highbrow. But by the time they got to like the fourth one, you're like, oh my God. Because like the introduction to the fourth Scream movie took like 10 minutes where they were like 3 layers deep in the movies because the movies within the movies were movies.
Yeah. Yes.
I think the first one was brilliant. The first one was Yeah,
as it's wont to be.
Yeah, to me, Scream only counts really just because graphically. Mm-hmm. I think that was what made it funny, is because it was aware of itself, because the graphics for the movie within the movie were just a ripoff of the original graphics of the movie itself.
And one of the things that I like about Scream as meta is also a lot of what I liked about Cabin in the Woods was their version of meta. It wasn't fourth wall breaking. It wasn't even necessarily self-reflective like the Terminator examples. They were meta because they were deconstruction. Yeah. You know, anybody who's like studied literature knows that like deconstructionism is all about like why are they doing what they're doing? What is the root of it? Because those movies literally would not exist without the predecessors. And although they obviously reference them by name, they never did it so like super gratuitously. They had fun with it, but it was deconstructing the genre. It was deconstructing the archetypes and the tropes and tearing them down and kind of rebuilding them in their own image. And that's really the kind of meta that I appreciate.
Yeah.
Yeah, that we could. But yeah, I just wrote that down. So deconstruction is a form of metafiction. Mm-hmm. No. We could probably do a whole episode just on that.
Yeah. This is definitely why we're.
I'll come back for that one.
Right. This is definitely why we're having to narrow this down, because it's such a broad spectrum of stuff, and there's so many things that we can tackle between fourth wall breaking and certain commentary and all of that stuff we need to find.
I lost myself there for a while when I went down a rabbit hole, and I was like starting to find like examples in Homer, and I'm like, okay, I gotta back up from here, because it actually like it's not as new as all that.
No, not at all. But I do have to say that it was impossible to find out what was the first instance of breaking the fourth wall in comics. Golden Age, they were doing it. Even like the old black and white cartoons, they were doing it. Felix the Cat did it all the time.
Yeah,
right.
Even the Warner Brothers cartoons did it all the time. The Mickey Mouse cartoons did it all the time. It was, you know, something that was very common, especially early on. So, like Superman and Clark Kent, you know, they would always wink at the camera. You know, they'd say, you know, I have no idea, you know, who Superman is. Wink, wink. You know.
Okay. So now we're on to the fourth wall, breaking the fourth wall. And for those of you who are not quite familiar with the term, breaking the fourth wall is a reference initially to stage play storytelling, where the set is comprised of 3 walls, the fourth wall being the audience. I mean, obviously, if you had 4 walls there, you can see what they were doing. So the audience was the fourth wall. And the actors were to ignore the audience so that you would have the immersive belief that you were watching a narrative. And breaking the fourth wall was when an actor would turn to the audience out of or in character, whatever, but address them directly as though they're aware that they're being watched. So this concept, of course, carries over to other forms of literature and movies. And
Shakespeare did it all the time.
Shakespeare did it all the time. So it made it a very prominent literary device, a clear example of reminding the audience that they are, in fact, viewing a work of fiction. And their self-awareness of it. And so, like Greg said, it's hard to pinpoint exactly where in superhero media, because, you know, we talk about superheroes here, where that would have started. And one of the first ones I found, I was with you on the Superman one, definitely. I was surprised to learn how much early Superman comic books referenced or did that.
Yeah.
Right. Well, and
that carried over to the Adventures of Superman with George Reeves, the television show. Yeah, he did it all the time. He would like say, "I don't know, Lois," and then wink at the camera.
Right. It's one of those you kind of have to ask, and this goes down to what makes good or bad metafiction. Basically, the intent behind why are we breaking the fourth wall? And for some people, it's immersion, but for a lot of modern stuff in the last like 10, 15-ish years, it's just a form of levity. Yeah. So it's like, hey. Yeah, that's fun, isn't it, guys? Are you having fun?
Yeah, the old Superman comics, it was more of a way of including the reader into the story.
Right. Yeah. It's like it's cheeky, but it's also like even though it is supposed to be breaking the fourth wall, it kind of adds like it's really fun.
Yeah. Yeah, I found articles, dissertations really, of people like denouncing the modern overuse of fourth wall breaking, and that's And that, I think, personally lends a lot to the concept of Easter eggs. I was going to ask Daniel what he thought. Do you think Easter eggs count as a form of metafiction?
Oh, absolutely. And on the subject of Superman, now, Easter eggs obviously are not breaking the fourth wall, but they're really good examples of metafiction. In the original 1970 Christopher Reeve Superman, he's about to change into the Superman costume for the very first time.
And his phone booth.
He stops at the phone booth, looks at it, kind of looks it up and down, and keeps running. That joke would have made zero sense without the original. If you weren't already aware of the George Reeves show and his use of the thing. So it wasn't breaking the fourth wall, but it was kind of a wink and a nod to people who recognize the fandom.
It's acknowledging that it's.
And actually, George Reeves never dressed in the phone booth.
The comic book was, though.
The comic book did, but George Reeves never did. He always went to an alley.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, but you know what? Smallville did it in the phone booth all the time because they had those little old-fashioned, in the newsroom, they had those old-fashioned phone booths that were out of use. And so he used those all the time.
So yeah, those references where it wouldn't even be a joke if it didn't already exist in the context of the predecessor. I like that kind of metafiction because it doesn't necessarily slow down the story. It doesn't break the fourth wall. It doesn't make you groan like, oh my God. No, it was like, I get it.
Yeah.
And it's just a cute little thing to just kind of, a little Easter egg for the fans. Then you literally just move on with the movie.
Okay. So yeah, I think Easter eggs could be its own whole thing too. There's a lot of really good, like I said, I found denouncements.
And cameos.
And cameos and stuff like that. So yeah, that would be a really good one to cover. I actually like that a lot.
Because I don't think you get much more meta than having Stan Lee show up in one of his creations.
Yeah, I think that counts really as a definitely meta element. We should do that one. We should definitely talk about that one. Now, when it comes to Superman, the epitome of fourth wall breaking metafictional characters has to be Mr. and Mrs. Pitlick. And I know Greg hates Miss. We've already established.
The only time I liked him was in the Adventures of Superman cartoon where Gilbert Gottfried did the voice.
Okay.
And it was brilliantly written.
So Mr. and Mrs. Pitlick was an extra-dimensional imp within the context of the story who, from his outside perspective in another dimension, viewed Superman and his adventures in very much the same context that we as the readers would view in Superman. And originally, he was just meant to be like a foil for Superman. Make him say his name backwards, and he can go home. And that's obviously an overly complicated thing to do. It's like, how often can you trick one guy into doing the same thing? So the first couple of issues where he appeared in, it was clever Superman tricking him to say his name backwards. But as time went by, as a reader, you're like, how is that? Come on, I mean, if I were Mr. and Mrs. Pitlick and I had the powers of a god, I would not fall for it that easy, And so there became a time when it became very metafictional, very self-aware. They, the writers, especially towards the 90s, started actually addressing the fact of how very contrite that particular trope was. And Mrs. Pitlick would speak to the world and speak of it and talk about it and stuff. So I really like Mrs. Pitlick in that context. But even Batman, I found. I don't know if you saw this.
You're about to say the only other DC character I hate more than.
So even Batman in the comic books, not the same as Superman, but I found there were instances where Batman, was under fire for violence in the comics, and Batman would actually, within the story, stop to tell the audience because it was expecting children to read the comic books. Basically, the don't do this at home kind of thing. Where one instance I found very specifically, he convinces Robin to avoid the villain's gun and to disarm him because without the weapons, the villains are just cowards. And he tells the readers, basically, don't be afraid to stand up for what's right, and then goes back to the story.
I want to say that was actually the first appearance of Catwoman.
Was it?
I think so. They're in a boat. And he's telling Robin that, and then Batman just sits back and lets Robin take care of it.
Yes. Yeah. And so that's a really good one, and very much like in the 50s, the 50s, in the way that Mrs. Pitlick became popular, they went ahead and created a very similar character for Batman, and I think honestly, Batmite, who Greg really hates, Batmite actually did a much better job of it right from the start. Actually, he would bring up the Batman comic books, and you would see him in the other dimension reading the Batman comic books, and you'd have, what was the oh god, the artist, was it, you know this, and I'm gonna feel so embarrassed when you know what I'm talking about, who would draw the picture within the picture within the picture within the picture within the picture.
Escher?
Yes. Okay. So well, it was Escher, and some others would do it. I've seen it. It's a very well known artistic illusion that they do, and you would have Batmite reading the cover, and then in the comic it was Batmite reading the cover of Batman reading the cover.
It's all very Spaceballs. Rick Moranis watching Rick Moranis.
Yes.
Yeah.
Rick Moranis, exactly. So Batmite would do that, and especially when it transferred to other media, it got really, really funny. And just like Greg has his favorite instance of Mitch's Piddalick on the animated series with Gilbert Gottfried, a lot of time it has to do with the writing and the character.
The writing was brilliant on that episode.
Yes, Gilbert Gottfried played Mrs. Piddalick in the Superman animated series. The Batman Brave and the Bold series with Batmite, I just thought Paul Rubin as Batmite was brilliant, and the whole time his shtick was fourth wall. Like, he would have the comic books and he'd be berating Batman. He's like, no, you need to do it like this. You know, he like literally pops up and he goes, ooh, one of the old obscure villains. You're fighting like Calendar Man. You don't see Calendar Man anymore.
It's like, Brave and the Bold is very underrated.
Yeah, Brave and the Bold is amazing. But I have to say that Paul Rubens is probably one of the most underused, brilliant actors out there. I mean, some of his performances throughout the years, I mean, just blows your mind that he was actually part of that. I remember for the longest time trying to convince people that he was in Buffy the Vampire Slayer movie. And they were like, no, that's not him. And I was like, no, that's totally him. And he's got probably the funniest, longest death scene in movie history.
But, Paul Rubin, obviously amazing. Batmite in this story was great because he got frustrated with the direction the show was going. And so he decides to petition to get the show canceled. So basically, when the show was actually canceled, they wrote the final episode was Batmite getting the show canceled and explaining why. And he is addressing all the fanboy nyas and the nitpickies and the trolls and all that stuff. And then he's like going on and until he realizes, oh crap, I'm part of this cartoon. I'm canceling myself. But that was the final episode of The Brave and the Bold. And that was just like when he realizes, like, uh-oh. And that was the end.
If you get a chance, I highly suggest watching the entire series of Brave and the Bold. It was a really brilliant cartoon. I especially loved how they brought in, like, Space Ghost. They brought in other characters from other, the other superheroes from, like...
It was a lot of Silver Age love.
Yes.
And a lot of Fourth World stuff in there.
Probably the funniest top man you'll ever run across.
But I love when they're fighting the Doom Patrol, who we're going to come up later. But in the carnival that they're at, there are posters for like the Freaks, which are actually nods to other Doom Patrol characters throughout the years.
Oh, that's awesome.
There's all kinds of stuff like that littered throughout the whole thing and stuff like that. One of my favorite, and this is a more modern Mitch's Piddalick story, was in like the mid-2000, 2005 maybe. It was a story called Emperor Joker, where the Joker manages to trick Mitch's Piddalick out of his powers. And now the Joker has transdimensional reality warping powers. And like 50% of that book is the Joker breaking the fourth wall and talking to people, and it's really funny. Like he creates a bizarro Batman who has no face under the mask, and his utility belt is upside down, so all the stuff is falling out of it. Stuff like that.
Oh my!
It was really funny. But that's one of my favorite ones.
So the real question is, when he loses the powers and goes back to being mortal Joker, does he still retain the knowledge that he's in a comic book /
There's actually, I found several surprising examples of Joker breaking the fourth wall, and there are some like people who read into it in the idea that Joker is not so much crazy, he's hyper sane. Like he's got the kind of sanity that allows him to adapt to reality no matter what, and that he actually might be aware that he's a comic book character. And there's several like for instance, in the 90s, Spider-Man was replaced by his clone and had this modern. They were trying to modernize the costume, and I actually like Ben Reilly's costume. It's the one that Spider-Man ends up in. But in the Batman Spider-Man crossover, Joker actually addresses Spider-Man's costume. It's like, you're not Spider-Man. he's like, no, your costume is all wrong, you know. So and he talks to the audience in that one too, and even to the point of manipulating the environment. He moves the speech bubbles around. That's how far Joker goes with it.
Neat. So, I love that.
I like it a lot.
So Joker has had a couple of ones of that too. But the biggest turn to me, and to a lot of comic book fans, especially older ones who are familiar with the older stuff, Crisis on Infinite Earths. It was the first time that, in and of itself, the Crisis of Infinite Earths to me is a metafictional story, because the idea is that the writers in the real world. The idea is that DC Comics has had so much continuity from so many years and so many different versions of so many different characters to reconcile why. That's when the idea of the multiverse, in at least comic books, first became popular. You know, now everybody knows multiverse. It's in so much media nowadays. But back when I was a kid, like, you know, you go in a room and say multiverse, like, you know, whatever. And so Crisis on Infinite Earths was basically the merger of all of these realities into one. And one of the main characters in this story, two of them, we'll talk about in a minute, was Psycho Pirate. And Psycho Pirate, really obscure Justice Society villain, actually, who has this like emotion. He has the ability to manipulate people's emotions. He can feed off of energy from emotions and change people's emotions, and he affects the psyche. He's like a pirate that steals psychic energy, and he ends up being constructed by one of the other main characters in the story, Pariah, to help them in manipulating things to the right way to get the world in the right way. And they give him extra power, but he ends up with so much cosmic power and awareness that he becomes aware that he's in a comic book. And it starts to freak him out because he gets paranoid. He even gets to the point where he turns around and accuses the audience of being perverts for watching him.
That's wonderful.
He brings other long, obscurely forgotten characters out of limbo to create this other team, go on these missions. And at one point he tries to convince them to escape into the real world and kill the audience so that the writers will stop having control over their lives. It's a really crazy.
This is within the ultimate the
DC Universe, Crisis on Infinite Earths.
So it's within the Infinite Earths storyline.
It's in the storyline, yeah.
Yeah, that's where that starts.
That's where that starts. Now, if anybody has seen the Crisis on Infinite Earths on the CW, which was loosely based on elements from that, you see the character Pariah, who in this they made a version of Wells. But Pariah, they almost, I was actually really disappointed when the actual Crisis crossover happened, because the previous crossover had the first one where they go over and they meet Batwoman and they're in Arkham Asylum in Batwoman's world. They actually have the mask, the gold mask that Psycho Pirate wears. And you actually see that, and that's like the cliffhanger, is the gold mask of Psycho Pirate. But when you get to the following year, when you get to the Crisis on Infinite Earth, the mask isn't, they don't use Psycho Pirate. I was very, very let down by that. But at the same time, I can also see why that would have been a really hard fit for what they were trying to do.
Yeah.
But yeah, and he continued to have.
And it was kind of crazy. A lot of the stuff in that series, that crossover, the Crisis crossover, was like really last minute.
Yeah.
Ezra Miller really. I mean, they had already wrapped and they pulled him in because then they filmed it and they I think it was 2 days before it aired. They shoved it in there. I mean, it was like
the very concept of, to me, and again, we'll ask as panel experts. To me, the very concept of multiverse is a metafictional device.
And I want to say that multiverse stuff actually happened in Fantastic Four first.
Did it?
Yeah, way, way, way early. Because I mean, they were always delving into crazy stuff like that in Fantastic Four.
But like in the specific context of a multiverse, did they dive into a multiverse that involved like literal characters from a parallel comic strip, for example?
Yeah.
Because that's kind of the big difference. There's a difference in my mind between, oh, hey, there's another universe versus there's another universe that you're already familiar with.
Yeah.
Well, they talked about alternate dimensions where every choice made.
Well, no, we're talking about are they like, for instance, this is the next really big one that came out of Crisis on Infinite Earths. So at one point, the editors, and I don't remember where he first appeared. I'm sorry, but they used him he might have been in one of the lead-ups to Crisis on Infinite Earths. But there is a version of Superboy.
Oh, Superboy
Prime. So within the context of DC Universe, in all the versions since Crisis on Infinite Earths, there is a version of Superboy who was not just rocketed from a exploding Krypton to Earth. He was rocketed from an exploding Krypton to the real Earth, where he had no powers, and he was in the world where he eventually came across Superboy comic books, and he recognized himself. Because he read Superboy comic books.
Sure.
And he starts to wonder, okay, what happened? So he figures out he's not from the real world. He's from a fictional world in the real world where he has no powers. So he wants to he doesn't like his life where he is. It's not the perfect life that Superboy had in the comic books. So he wants to come to the comic book world where he can take over that Superboy's life and have a better life and be, praise the Superboy and all this stuff. Of course,
I don't know if that's horrifying or if I'm rooting for him.
Yes, eventually it gets horrifying. Eventually it gets horrifying because by the time the Crisis on Infinite Earths is done and they balance everything out to where they got one universe, years go by, and Jeff Johns, who we all have a love-hate relationship with him, Jeff Johns brings him out of obscurity and creates a follow-up, basically a sequel to Crisis on Infinite Earths. Very unimaginatively called The Infinite Crisis, in which Superboy and another version of Lex Luthor and the original Golden Age Superman and Lois Lane, you find out that when the world was combined, not everybody was merged. Some of them were placed in a separate paradise dimension. This gets really crazy.
Put up for adoption.
Yeah, it's the only way that you can get this in comic books. Okay, people, only in superhero comic books. So they're in this paradise dimension where they're supposed to live happily ever after, except Superboy Prime, from, the Prime Earth being the Earth where, the writers who create the stories are, is getting so angry with all the way that the stories and things are going. And this is a very big bane across the comic book. People who've been reading comic books since like early 2010s hate the idea, but they call it punching reality, because Superboy Prime, in an effort to break out of the paradise world, starts punching reality. And this is what DC Comics uses to explain away all of the inconsistencies in their stories and continuity, and where things have veered off course, where they got back to being as messy as they were when they had the crisis in the first place.
And this is a really interesting element to me when it comes to metafiction in general, is why is it happening? Is it happening because they painted themselves into a philosophical corner and they don't know how to get out of it? Is it happening because the timeline is so messed up and so jumbled they need a clean slate? Is this a cash grab? Or is this like just a wink and a nod to the fans? Like, I can handle the wink and a nod to the fans, but if this is happening because you've had dozens of writers over 30 years who nobody was keeping track of anything. There was no Kevin Feige for 30 years of DC Comics, so they just need a clean slate. Okay, I'm kind of okay with that because I like clean slates. I do. But if you're just looking for a cash grab where it's like, hey, we already did the clean slate, but we're going to go ahead and do this one because we know you're going to buy it, even though it's total crap.
Right. Well, that's a recurring trope I've seen a bunch. And once you realize that it's more like, we're just going to redo this for reasons, it's
well, me personally, I think Infinite Crisis on Infinite Earths, it was that. It had a purpose.
Yes.
They were trying to clean it up. And I honestly think that that Infinite Crisis was intended to be that too. My problem with Infinite Crisis is it actually kicked off the trend of the annual massive event where it got to where you couldn't understand a single story unless you were collecting like 50 issues and
Right,
every
the
crossover.
ultimate crossover
and,
episode.
And I think Infinite Crisis, to me, there may be people who disagree. That's what really cemented the idea of it being a cash grab. And after that, definitely I agree. Just about every other one except for Spider-Verse, and I will stand by Spider-Verse as being brilliant in every way. I mean, it inspired an Academy Award-winning movie. I'm going to tell you that right now.
It's like you didn't even have to acknowledge that any of these other Spider-Men existed, though.
Yeah.
It's like for thinking of the CW crossover, it was like, okay, in order for you to watch these like 7 or 8 episodes, you have to have watched every
Episode
single
of every
other
other
thing,
show.
which I was not down for because
Okay.
I'm lazy. Just.
Well, at any rate, Superboy Prime ended up getting stuck there and became a villain, and yeah. So
I dig it.
There's nobody rooting for him, but and another really cool one that I think is the progenitor of a lot of the modern fourth wall breaking characters that we are familiar with, such as Deadpool. A lot of Deadpool was a direct ripoff of this character, is Ambush Bug.
Yep.
Ambush Bug, and I don't. It's just so difficult to describe this character if you have not read him and are not familiar with him.
Which I am not.
He basically starts off as this Superman villain, and part of the shtick with Ambush Bug is you don't know his origin. Every time anything close to an origin comes out, it's always completely different. It's kind of like in Joker in The Dark Knight, where he's like he's lying.
Yeah.
You know, and that's the same
He
thing.
likes his origin to be multiple choice.
Yeah, multiple choice. So
he looks like a very metafiction-y character.
yeah, and he starts right off talking to the audience and making fun of Superman and everything. He starts off as a villain and then tries to be a hero. And he's very crazy, very fourth wall breaking, and even has teleportation powers. In fact, at one point, Marvel had to Deadpool, when he first started in his own solo series, had a teleportation device. They had to take it away from him because they were getting even closer and closer to the similarities with Ambush Bug.
Mm-hmm.
But this is actually a really good character. Greg, I know Greg played the DC Universe Online game before me. I only just recently started playing it, so I haven't gotten to encounter him that way. But he's definitely...
He was a lot of fun in the game. They've kind of taken a lot of the Ambush Bug parts out. It used to be that you would go into different instances, and then he would be hiding in the instances, and you could find him, and you'd get loot, and he'd like talk to you and stuff.
But he also explained part of the story directly to you in a way that you were aware you were watching a story, playing a story. So to me, that actually kind of makes a lot of sense.
And he also was like one of the key factors of the vault.
The vault.
I don't know if he's still one.
No, it's Joker has it now, but
yeah.
So finishing up with DC, I really have to throw out there Grant Morrison. Grant Morrison is responsible for a bevy of amazing comic book stories throughout the years. He's created, I can't even narrow it down to a list. So for now, we're going to talk about two of my favorite aspects. He wrote the seminal Animal Man comic book of the late 80s, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So in the 80s, DC Comics created what they called the Vertigo comics, and they were meant to be a more mature line of comic books. And because before then, I mean, even as late as the early 80s, the editors still had their minds stuck in the idea that comic books were for kids. There were, their target audience was, teenage boys or lower.
Mm-hmm.
And so
this was their response to the
Comics Code.
Comics Code. Comics Code kind of is what evolved that perception, but they were kind of still stuck in that perception. And when you get to the 80s and you get to the baby boomers taking over and wanting to be more mature, who didn't want to, we all blame the millennials for the nostalgia, but it started way before us, before them. I don't even know where I fit anymore. But
it's a mystery.
It's a mystery right now. But the baby boomers start taking over, and they want to keep it going. And so now they're like, well, why can't these characters grow up and mature and do these amazing things? And Stan Lee definitely was one of the ones who got that going. And we talked about that previously with the whole. Watch the other episodes. Anyway, so
right, watch that Comics Code Authority episode.
Comics Code Authority episode. But basically, DC creates this version, this whole subline called Vertigo, where it's like, okay, you can take mature content, you can create characters and stories that are separate.
And more indie type stories.
And they were more indie,
like Sandman.
Sandman definitely was one of them, but a great one was Animal Man. Animal Man is a character who basically has the powers of every animal. Any animal he is next to, he can borrow their powers through the morphogenic field. He was granted these powers by an alien. It kind of reminded me of Greatest American Hero, because they gave him these powers, but they didn't really explain how they worked. And so anyway,
it was just like, surprise, you have powers.
Yeah, you have powers. Have fun with that. But it was an amazing story. It was critically acclaimed, and when the book was canceled, and another thing, he was a father, and his responsibilities as a hero got in the way of his family life, his career. It was really.
It's all very Spider-Man.
Yeah, Spider-Man, but Spider-Man as an adult before Peter got an adult. It was like, what if all this stuff happens, and he's struggling with all these things, these responsibilities, and then you get to the end when the book is canceled, and Grant Morrison literally writes himself into the story to tell him, to comfort him and explain to him he's done a good job, but of course when Animal Man realizes that he's just a fictional character, it's like all this other stress just finally breaks him, and it's a really sad page. If you see the comic book page, the very last pages, where Grant Morrison is talking to him, and then he gets to this panel. He's like, okay, well, I'm running out of space on this page. I can't, I'd love to tell you it's going to be better. I'd love to talk to you more, but there's just no time. There's no space.
You're about to not exist.
You're about to not exist.
Yeah.
And then the last page shows him sitting in a field of white where the world has disappeared around him before he's gone.
Pretty dark.
It is pretty dark, right?
Jesus.
It's the most serious example of breaking the fourth wall to me, where it's most of the times it's played for laughs and fanboy nods, but that was actually really dark. Doom Patrol was another one that Grant Morrison worked on, had a lot of those elements.
Right.
Anybody who has watched the Doom Patrol TV show, I know you've seen it, and you know who I'm talking about.
Yes, Mr. Nobody.
Mr. Nobody
is the easiest example.
Alan Tudyk is just like amazing in this role.
He's fantastic in
this. He's amazing in everything.
Oh yeah, this is
I love
true.
him in this. Though.
He spends the whole time, like he starts off, he's the narrator.
He is narrating the entire story.
Until you realize that he knows it's a story, and he knows it's comic book wackiness, and he makes fun of them and everything. It's actually brilliant. It is brilliant. I've said this before. Of all of the superhero-based properties, Doom Patrol is actually one of the smartest that I've seen, and that's because it wholeheartedly embraces its source material, the wackiness of it. It doesn't try too hard, other than the fact that they cuss way too much. It's way too much. It's one of those, because it's just like the HBO thing. Is like we do it because we can, not because it adds to the story. But
also, Brendan Fraser's back. God bless him.
Oh my God, yes. Brendan Fraser and Matt Bomer, who I'm a huge fan of, and they're so good.
All the cast members on that show.
It's so emotional, but all of the aspects where it breaks the fourth wall is just, it's amazing, and that's definitely taken directly from Grant Morrison's storylines in the book and stuff. My favorite, absolute favorite, and I was telling Anna and a friend about this last night about my favorite breaking the fourth wall. The comic book, within a comic book itself, to ever happen was not the Grant Morrison run, but it was the last run before the relaunch of DC Comics in 2011, what they called the New 52. Was Ambush Bug was on the Doom Patrol, and the villain, the House of Dada. These were literally villains modeled after Dada art form.
Okay, I like it already.
Okay,
I'm in.
And it's literally the villains. And the House of Dada were about to win. They're having and doing the big monologue like happens in comic book stories. And then Ambush Bug comes in and taps him on the shoulder and basically whispers in his ears. And you hear the bad guy going, "They're going to do what?" And then he refers to Dan DiDio, who is the editor-in-chief of DC Comics at the time. And he goes, "What's a DiDio?" And he's like, and basically he tells him that they're canceling the comic book.
Mhm.
And so the villains are like, "Well then, what's the point?" And they just give up and go home. They're like literally in the middle of a story, and then they get like, whereas every other comic book before the relaunch had a chance to wrap up their storylines, Doom Patrol just stops in the middle of the story and is like, "Well, what's the point? Why should we even bother finishing this story if you're just going to relaunch it?"
So what I really like about that aspect of metafiction is, you kind of started the conversation about how this has been going on for literally decades and decades and decades, way longer than anybody thinks. Like our grandparents were enjoying metafiction.
Right.
Because, number one, there's no new ideas. Everything is either Homer or the Bible or Shakespeare. Like everything is coming from those.
Fair.
Yeah.
So like there's no new ideas. So we've been rehashing the same themes and tropes and stereotypes since day one. So what's happening is we have this weird trend in fiction where we now have to meta the meta fiction.
Yeah.
And it's just like layers on top of layers. So like, okay, so the first time you do the meta fiction, you've got Superman looking phone booth up and down. And then the next time you do it, he's actually going into the phone booth and decides he doesn't like it because it's stupid and why would anybody ever do this? And like, I could just see like this weird fictional tirade that Clark Kent goes, is like, this is the dumbest idea ever. Why would anybody ever think of doing this? But it's only funny because like you're confronting the existing trope. So with this example here, you've already established the meta fiction standard of, okay, cool, I'm a supervillain in a comic book. What do? Well, I'm going to die. Okay, fine. Well, now you have to take it a step further. You have to raise the ante. Okay, I'm a supervillain in a comic book. Now what do? Well, now I'm going to go home. So you're always like taking it a step further.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
And for me, my apogee for that, my favorite example of meta on meta was the cartoon special Turtles Forever.
Yes.
From like a decade ago.
Oh my God,
where-
yes, that's
where-
a great example. I couldn't believe I didn't think about that.
Where they took the 1980s Ninja Turtles and then the Millennial Turtles, where they were like super buff and
Aggressive.
super
Right.
super aggro, super buff,
Yeah.
and they created their own turtle multiverse. But what did it was this one scene, because anybody who's watched the original 1980s Ninja Turtles knows that they were always breaking the fourth wall. They were always looking at the audience and saying something dumb and making commentary on Bebop and Rocksteady and the Shredder and all of that. And then there was one scene in the movie where the 1980s Ninja Turtles said something to the camera, and one of the bad guys from the Millennial Turtles was like,
"What are you doing?
"Who are you talking to?" And then just proceeded to pound them out. And it was like, it was so meta because you had like the 1980s Turtles in their 1980s element interacting with Millennial Turtles in Millennial element, and neither of them were changing anything about themselves.
No, exactly.
They were behaving exactly as they would. And then, not to
Even to the point where it's stock animation.
Yeah.
Like things in the old Turtles would repeat. And the new Turtles, it was really funny.
Spoiler for a movie that's been out for a decade. The big ending confrontation is where you get the literal first generation black and white turtles
From the comic book.
from the comic books, from Eastman and Laird, and they're like super edgy, hardcore badass. Where they're like the original ones where the noses were super down for like no reason.
And they're all their masks were the same color.
Yeah, all their masks
the
were the
original
same
Turtles
color.
all wear red.
And the original Turtles thought that the 1980s Turtles were super pansy and were just making fun of them for being lame. And they're like, we're the only real badasses of the Turtleverse kind of thing. And it was just like, watching this as an adult, I'm like, this is hilarious. I can appreciate all the layers of meta. And I also can appreciate that evolution from the old black and white badass Turtles to the 1980s campy, fourth wall breaking Turtles to the super buff steroid Millennial Turtles, and kind of that evolution of the franchise and just how they kind of brought it all together. So the whole point behind all of this is that raising the ante of the meta on top of meta on top of meta, and how that's become almost the new normal.
Yeah, that's one of my. I think we should do an entire episode on just. I call it escalation. One of my problems that I have a lot with now is, especially when you reboot a universe, you should start small and go big. No, it always goes straight to the biggest possible thing, and it's like, well, where do you go from here?
There's no power creep. There's no excitement anymore.
in it. I would love to talk more about that. Really.
Right. We'll save that one for later.
We got a couple more really cool. I'm going to talk real quick about one of my favorite things. When John Ostrander took over the Suicide Squad book from Grant Morrison, as a goodbye to Grant Morrison, he literally wrote a character called the Writer into Suicide Squad, who was Grant Morrison on his little laptop typing up the story, and had him killed in battle. That's my last DC one. But then Marvel really picks it up in a completely different way.
Mm-hmm.
And I know you read up more on it, and you're more familiar with it. Tell us about She-Hulk.
She-Hulk, well, I think starting from the first comic, she's like tearing out the pages, right? So.
Well, the very first issue, I just remember it was her second ongoing series.
Yeah.
And the very first issue, the cover, she basically is talking to the audience. She's threatening them. You better buy this book.
Yeah.
She's like, you better buy this book this time. And it ends on issue 50. It's an homage to the original cover, and she's like, I told you what would happen if you didn't buy this book. It's actually, but she spent a lot of time doing that.
Marvel, they've been breaking the fourth wall. I mean, like Spider-Man did it all the time. They had characters doing it all the time. But
I know there were several instances in Marvel where they had characters visiting the Marvel offices.
Yeah.
Because I remember Spider-Man at one point managed to cross over into the real universe and talk to Stan Lee.
Yeah.
The 90s animated series actually ended, again, multiverses do this, ended with Spider-Man being comforted by Stan Lee in the real world, voiced, of course, by Stan Lee.
Yeah.
So that was pretty amazing. Marvel had a really good long-standing history of that. Spider-Man's done it too. Most recently, Paul Dini's Ultimate Spider-Man cartoon animated series, which was divisive among fans because it was definitely aimed towards kids, with still a lot of really good, nods to the older fans. But to make it more accessible to kids, they had Spider-Man talk to the audience a lot in that.
And they kind of brought that full circle in the MCU. And depending on your perspective, you could have seen it as a campy wink and a nod, or you could have seen it as, oh my God, why would you create this horrible, terrible paradox? But in Captain Marvel, when they had the Stan Lee movie cameo in that one in the 90s, he's sitting there practicing the script for Mallrats,
yes,
where he was playing Stan Lee,
yes,
talking about literally his comic books.
Okay,
which are
that
now,
is 100% meta.
It's super.
That's 200% meta.
It's meta on layers. It's stacked on stacks. But and again, you either love it because it's campy, or you hate it because it creates the dumbest paradox. I'm actually kind of more in the latter camp. I didn't like it. I didn't like the paradox. I thought it was dumb because now you've made canonically in the MCU.
Now he's him, the person. Now he's him, the
person,
omniscient character.
But deeper than that, you literally have comic books dating back to the 60s in the MCU, in the Marvel Cinematic Universe.
Yeah. So
where are all the people who were like watching the news of the fight in Brussels or Berlin or whatever the Civil War one was at the airport? So where are all the people watching the news of the fight, seeing Spider-Man and being all like,
is that
I've been reading his comics for the last 35 years.
That brings up two really good things, and I would love to talk about these. I'm gonna put a pin on them, but there are examples of that in the comic books. Marvel did a series, was it in the late 90s or the 2000s, called Marvel's Comics.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a series of comic books that what if the people who lived in the Marvel Universe speculated, people who see these superheroes every day wrote a comic book.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like basically the Spider-Man one. It's like, what if the people in New York who see Spider-Man around but don't know his origin, if they were to write a comic book about Spider-Man and what would they guess Spider-Man was? And so
I would be okay with that because at least the superhero exists first.
Yeah.
But they've created a canonical timeline where the Spider-Man comic has existed since 1964,
right,
63.
No, I completely agree with you.
Spider-Man shows up on the scene in 2007.
Exactly.
Like, 40 years later.
But also, Daniel, you're assuming just from that little appearance that there was a Spider-Man comic, that there was a Fantastic Four.
Well, then why
comic.
would Stan Lee be playing Stan Lee?
He was literally
yeah.
practicing scenes from Mallrats where he explicitly references Spider-Man, Vulture, Doctor
Okay.
Doom,
The Hulk.
the
Yeah.
Hulk. Like he explicitly mentions these comics
Yeah.
that have been around since the 60s. and
However, you know, in the Infinite Multiverse, maybe the Mallrats movie in the MCU, he doesn't.
Well, and actually,
I know it's a stretch.
that happened later.
I know it's a stretch.
Because remember, they had that whole thing with him where they try to tie up the cameos in Guardians of the Galaxy too.
Yeah,
and they're
where he
like,
was
oh yeah,
Watcher.
he's a watcher.
So
So I'm
He
sure
could've-
someone could yada their way out of it and be like, yeah, he's a watcher. He has all of this
well,
knowledge.
that's
but
definitely an amazing
it's
meta.
still the
No, I
It was
am
still a stretch.
more
Yeah.
convinced than I was before we started this episode that we need more than one episode to cover metafiction. But
yes, we do.
I want to barrel through the Marvel era of
Let's get to that
fourth
low
wall.
hanging fruit.
Yes. So there are
The
just
one
real
you
quick
guys
before-
were waiting
Before
for.
we get to the very end of Marvel, there are other really good examples outside of Marvel and DC, just like with any comic books. Now, I'm one of those that I just got stuck. I was a kid. I read Marvel and DC, and then I read Marvel and DC. And it's not that I have anything against independent publishers or anything like that. It's just that they were never my thing. But there are amazing stories. A lot of awards were given to a comic book called Cerberus. About the aardvark who, that was a really good comic book that references it. I know The Mask in the comic book and even kind of in the movie does that. There's one really good one that I found. I never read it, but I actually found it interesting. Jack of Fables. And if you're familiar with the Fables comic book, it's basically all of the fairy tale characters escape the comic book, and they have their own little neighborhood in New York called, what was it? Fairy Town, maybe, I think is what it's called. I didn't read it that much. But anyway, you know, it's like Red Riding Hood is trying to make it, and she's married to the Big Bad Wolf, who's a cop, who's a beat cop, and stuff like that. So Jack,
Like I don't know. I have a love-hate relationship with fairy tales now because
who's overdone.
with the exception of the occasional remake by Disney, with the exception of the occasional, you know, live action remake of an existing property, fairy tales have to exist in the metaverse now. Like,
Yeah.
fairy tales literally cannot stand by themselves anymore. It's all Shrek. It's all Once Upon a Time.
Fractured
It's
fairy
all-
tales, yeah.
It's all 10th Kingdom. Like, I couldn't even tell you who did it first because just like, you know, we've been saying, it's been going on forever.
Mm.
Like, you know, 10th Kingdom did it kind of early,
Yeah.
but it was happening, like, if you go all the way back to Silverlock decades
yeah.
ago.
One of my
Well,
favorites
also,
is, one
I
of
mean,
my
if you
favorites
really want
is
to,
like,
you can go all the way back to Rocky and Bullwinkle and the Fractured Fairy Tales.
that's what I said,
Yeah,
Fractured Fairy Tales.
that
That's
was
where it
my
kind of
one.
starts with me.
But we've reached a point now with fairy tales where they literally can't stand on their own anymore. They can only exist in shared universe metaverses.
So yeah, maybe we could
which-
talk sometime about like the meta properties of fairy tales.
And I think the difference between fairy tales and a lot of everything else that we've been discussing is how ubiquitous and well-known fairy tales are. Everybody knows Little Red Riding Hood. Everyone knows Cinderella. Everyone knows Snow White. So if I've been watching your Infinity Crisis Earths, which I'm not familiar with, just, you know, live with it, deal with it.
No,
I'm not. But like, if I had seen it and I'd be like, "What the hell is that yellow mask?" It would have gone over my head. I wouldn't have got the reference. But everybody gets Little Red Riding Hood reference. Everybody gets Cinderella.
I've
Everybody
actually
gets
had to
Snow White.
argue this with my husband about Spider-Man. I went over it because one day it just like blew my mind when I thought about it. When you read, I love spiders, as you know, because I grew up.
I did not know that about you.
As I grew up with Spider-Man.
Right? It's like, no.
And I love Spider-Man. And to me, spiders are not scary.
Mhm.
In fact, I get frustrated that they always have to portray spiders as being scary. And I think they're cute. And then they're saying, honestly, to God, I will tell everybody this: there are more species of frog in the world that will kill you by touching you than there are species of spider that will actually kill you by biting you.
Yes, water things are horrifying.
Okay.
Yes. So
Tracks.
anyway, but frogs are not considered scary. So, but then it occurred to me, well, maybe I'm not afraid of spiders because of Spider-Man. And then when you go back and you read the original comics in the 60s, the majority of people are under the belief that spiders were dangerous and icky and terrifying. So Spider-Man makes sense as being off kilter because he's a spider and people should be scared of him.
Mhm.
And that's why his character was so unique at that time. However, now he's a victim of his own success because modern Spider-Man, nobody thinks Spider-Man is scary because they're familiar with him. He's already ubiquitous with culture and everybody knows. So like people like me who associate Spider-Man with spiders, I don't find spiders scary because I don't find Spider-Man scary. And so when you read new retellings of Spider-Man, where he's Spider-Man and he's supposed to be scary because he's a spider, it doesn't work the same because people in the modern world don't think of spiders quite the way they used to because of Spider-Man.
Mm-hmm.
It's
a chicken or the egg thing.
Yeah, exactly.
It
so,
just kind of folds
I would love to do that kind of thing. But
right.
We have
Keep an
to
eye
talk,
out. That might be a fun podcast.
When we were talking about comic books within a comic world, and I don't know if this counts as metafiction or Easter egg or fourth wall, but you made a really good point with Logan, where
the actual X-Men comics are in the Logan movie with Professor X and Wolverine, and it was supposed to be the big finale. It was supposed to be the way that they close out the X-Men franchise, which is fine. It was a little weird though because the timeline got a little wonky because in our universe, obviously, the X-Men comics have been around since the 60s.
Yeah.
In their timeline, the X-Men have technically been around since the 60s, but the world didn't know about them till the 70s because they redid Days of Future Past. And then more crap went down in the 80s. So, like, in their timeline, there's some speculation. There's some, left to interpretation of when those comics were actually published in the X-Men universe.
Right, as a reaction to them existing.
Exactly. So
yeah.
maybe they started getting printed in the 70s. Maybe they started getting printed in the 80s. But no matter how you cut it, like, by the time we get to Dark Phoenix, which is supposed to have happened, like, late 80s, early 90s, nobody's talking about the comics.
Right.
So it's another one of those weird inconsistencies where it's like, cool, you're going to put this in the universe and then forget it exists.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
But even if it weren't for all of that, it's a halfway decent nod in terms of like, oh, you've got comics of the characters in the thing. It didn't do much for me. I thought the Logan story could have stood enough on its own. Obviously, they needed the comics just to get to the reservation site, which is fine. It just, I don't know. It just that meta inclusion didn't really do it for me.
Yeah.
Now, but to finish up, we have a couple minutes left, but we're going to talk a little while longer if y'all want to stick around or watch the rest of it on YouTube when we're done. The big daddy of fourth wall breaking, of course.
Now the one you've been waiting for.
Deadpool.
Yeah.
Everybody loves Deadpool. Not my super favorite character in the world, although I did really enjoy the movies.
Right? You have feelings. Express your feelings.
Yes.
I think when it comes to the movie, that if Colossus wasn't in that first film, I think that Deadpool needs.
He was in both.
Oh, he wasn't both?
Yeah, he was in both.
Okay.
But the first one
shows you how long it's been.
If he hadn't been in the movie, I think that counterposing Deadpool like that and being the perfect straight man for Deadpool, I think that it would have fallen on its face
completely.
But I think Colossus really glued that movie together and made it
right. Well, and it's like that's kind of what you have to do with those meta characters because it's like any comedy. If you've got just the person being funny without a straight man being like, hey, that's dumb, or okay, I guess I kind of like it, it's not fun.
Right.
Like, we need something that grounds those characters. Otherwise, that's how they end up being annoying.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's some of the best commentary I've ever heard about Deadpool. He only works when he's playing off of other people. Like,
right?
Yeah,
when he's...
being a narrator, like, it was cute, and him drawing himself on the bridge, that was cute. But his best moments were playing off of, Negasonic Warhead, playing off of Colossus, playing off of Francis. When he was being himself against characters who understood the stakes, that was when Deadpool was at his best.
Yeah,
right. Otherwise, it's just, it's like, and I think that's probably why they made those changes in the movies, because, I was exposed to the comics and to the video game first.
Yeah.
And those are very much like he's interacting with the comic, like, whenever you see him in the fighting games, he's like ripping the status bar down and hitting you
Yes,
with it.
yes.
And it's like it's so isolated in itself that it's like, yeah, it just makes him come off as an annoying character.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, even with me with the Spider-Man comic, Deadpool Spider-Man comic was great. I read that. It's the only thing I've ever deliberately bought with Deadpool in it. And one that really bears mentioning, we can talk more about Deadpool, but before it's gone, Gwenpool.
Yeah.
Now, this is a bizarrely created character, just the origin of how of how she came to be. Her actual powers that's her actual powers in this comic book, her metafiction. So, Gwen Stacy, after the Spider-Verse comic book came out and Spider-Gwen became popular, Marvel, as they are wont to do to try and boost the sale of comics, created a variant cover of all their comics for 1 month. And this particular month, it's what if Gwen Stacy were somebody other than a spider person? So every comic book that month, all the artists created some version of Gwen something. So there was like X-Gwen, and then there was, Dr. Gwen or whatever. It was just every comic book had
Dr. Gwen, medicine woman.
Everyone had their own Gwen Stacy variant cover. But the one for Deadpool had Gwenpool, who was based on Gwen Stacy, and the cover itself, just the cover itself, got so much attention for the design. And this is one of those ones where it goes on the art, where the art is everything. The design was so clever and well done. And it was like a kind of a pink Deadpool, but with like short sleeves and bike shorts. And so it prompted them to create this character named Gwenpool, who actually has nothing to do with Gwen Stacy or Deadpool in any way, shape, or form. Neither one. But she's from the real world and somehow ends up in the Marvel Universe. And she's a big fangirl of the Marvel Universe.
Oh, she's really cute.
So she knows.
So she created her own persona.
So she creates her own persona.
As a comic book fan.
Correct.
Okay.
She creates her own persona and names herself after
it.
Deadpool. Gwen says she calls herself Gwenpool. And that's her whole comic book, is that she knows all of the secrets of everybody in the Marvel Universe. There's like a point where, like, I think she has to actually hire Deadpool to protect her because there's assassins after her, and it's just like everything. And finally, it starts off, she's not aware.
One of the funniest scenes that I remember is when Jane Foster Thor, no one knew who she was, and she goes, Jane, like she turns around, and she goes, what? Like, she goes like, hey, I like pain, I'm in pain, or something like that,
Well, that was actually, I think, the funniest part, though, is because she knew she was in the comic book world, but to her, it was just a comic book world. So there were no stakes. She didn't actually honestly believe anything was real. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't until she realized, even though, yes, it was a fictional world, there's still stakes for these people. People still get hurt. Her actions were still causing things. It wasn't just this big fun playground, Like to her, she was like a video game and whatever she did, no big deal, right? But then eventually everybody starts getting really upset with her and all this conflict because she's creating all this unnecessary conflict with everybody. And so she had to eventually catch on that it wasn't just all fun and games, basically. Mm. It was a really bizarre
What I can really get behind with that entire concept, I mean, obviously they kind of wrote themselves in the corner like, hey, people really like this. How do we justify it? They went with such a realistic premise of somebody just doing a literal costume mashup cosplay for a convention. Like, that's the most real thing possible because, like, if you go to Gen Con, you go to Origins, you see all the mashups. You see the person who took Gomez Adams and Selena y los Dinos, put them together for Selena Gomez. Like, mashups are like all the rage right now.
Oh, no, my favorite.
It's the greatest thing ever. So to see, to think that somebody would realistically just do, Gwen Stacy and Deadpool and call her Gwenpool and go to a convention like that and somebody be like, I'm gonna make a comic book about that. It's so perfect. Like that's.
I also love the fact that I think her series was getting canceled or something, so that she started like crossing over to other stories and like trying to raise her popularity because she was afraid that if her comic went away that she would disappear. So she was like, trying to figure out a way of either getting back to her world or increasing her popularity so that she wouldn't just disappear.
Yeah, because didn't she end up with the Lara Kinney Wolverine book? Was one of the ones? Yeah, that was one of the ones I remember.
She was in I forget the name. There was like West Coast Avengers, I think, that they brought her into.
With Squirrel Girl.
With Squirrel Girl and a couple others, and then there was also America Chavez. And then also, yeah, she was like hitting on other heroes to try to become their girlfriend and stuff.
Yeah, she talked. She talked to the audience all the time.
Yeah.
She picked up that from Deadpool, and she was a really good version of that. And so.
I think my favorite example is probably the recent one is Tippy Toe.
Tippy Toe, yes.
Yeah, Squirrel Girl's squirrel talks to the audience
now. Yeah. We had some kind of debate maybe. So, where's the line between breaking the fourth wall and third-party omniscient narrator?
Stan Lee, first 100 issues of Spider-Man, he was always talking to the audience like, hello, true believers.
Greg feels that this is breaking the fourth wall. To me, he's not in the story himself.
And that's the difference.
Yeah.
Because a narrator is in the story telling their own story, even if it's in real time.
Yeah.
But he's not just a narrator, though, because he's his own character.
But is it like, I'm thinking of like a commercial. Like, is it a separate section at the end of each thing, or like a break in between each of them?
It's weaving throughout the entire story.
So here's kind of an example to help kind of resolve the difference between them. And it's going to go back to the comic books.
Yeah.
Kick-Ass.
Kick-Ass, yes.
Where he was his own narrator, and he was in the story, so he was his own narrator. And at the end, he broke the fourth wall. Obviously, he's breaking the fourth wall because he's the narrator the entire time. But he breaks the fourth wall of the fourth wall by saying, well, you think that I got out of this because I'm your narrator. Well, yeah, but what about American Pie, where Lester died? So screw you guys and your presumptions. I could be dead right now and you wouldn't even know it.
Right.
So, like, he's kind of like making that commentary on the commentary that just because you are a narrator does not necessarily mean, number one, that you got out. Number two, that you're a reliable narrator. Even H.P. Lovecraft had a short story where the narrator literally died at the end, and the last line of the story was him being aware of the blood rushing out of his head.
Yes.
Dying of a head wound.
I remember that one.
And you walk in with the expectation of, oh, well, this is a narrator telling his own story. Clearly he got out alive. And you get to the end, you're like, oh, crap, my bad.
If nobody lives to tell about it, how do you know about it?
Yeah, so that sort of thing. So, but that is different from a third person, from a third person omniscient. A traditional, Anne Rice traditional comic book where it's like, yes, so and so did this and so did this. At no point does that third person omniscient ever become part of the story, whether they're Stan Lee or not. Stan Lee is way up here telling the story. If he's in it, he's no longer third person omniscient. Like, that's literally a completely different narrative, just by definition.
Right.
Mm-hmm. So, like, with that sort of thing, now, if you are going to be a third person omniscient and insert yourself into the story, and suddenly it's your story,
we're starting to split hairs
why
again.
though? Why
Yeah.
though? Why
Well,
though?
like I said, we got a couple more minutes, and I really want to come back to some of these things. But Chaucer is one of the ones that you and I had talked about like a long time ago when I first was rolling this idea around.
Mm-hmm.
Talk like the different vignettes or whatever within like the Knight's Tale, or where he's talking about himself, and then he talks to the audience outside of it. So that's kind of, like I said, that's why it's the difference to me. And I know we love Stan Lee. Everybody loves Stan Lee. And yes, he definitely was a persona. I agree that he was a persona. But as a character, he wasn't in the stories. Now, there were some stories, like I said, when Spider-Man makes it to the Marvel offices. But, and that's kind of, even if it's Stan Lee writing it, it's still Spider-Man was the one breaking the fourth wall.
Now, what I have seen, and with mixed results, is a third-person omniscient telling a story, and then at the end shifting to second person, where the third person is no longer telling the story, but then shifts to talking to the audience.
Yeah.
So you see that with.
And I think that Stan's done that.
Okay. So you see that also with like classic literature, like Pilgrim's Progress. And that was actually a really bad example because it was so stupid. Because, he was. Pilgrim's Progress was a dumb book because you spent the entire book. You spent the entire book with the narrator being all like, and then Gluttony ate all the food. The character's name was Gluttony. And then Wrath had all of the anger. His name was Wrath. And then, like, literally at the end of the book, he shifts to second person and starts talking to the reader. And he's all like, "Gentle reader, I don't know if you caught on, but there were some hidden messages in there."
Okay.
There's a reason his name was Raph. And like, it was so
God.
stupid the way that he thought he was being so clever. And then at the end, it's all like, "Oh, there was code in there that you probably missed. I'm going to talk to you about it."
That's like a very fan fiction-y
It was
depiction of
so,
it.
like,
That's something I would have read when I was like 14
Yeah,
on like
like,
fanfiction.com or something.
I still get mad thinking about Pilgrim's Progress.
That is so funny.
But like that sort of thing where you're shifting, not necessarily where you're a character in it, but you're shifting from third person to second person.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent. Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, so we've covered a lot of really good. We got more into just metafiction in general than I intended, so I would really love to evolve on more of this.
Right, we can play more
But
of this.
I
These
think
would
we're
be
being
fun.
talked to. Is this okay?
Are we supposed to know what he's saying?
I don't know.
No, I think he's.
Oh, okay.
But so yeah. Any other? I mean, I didn't mean to burst your Stanley balloon, but any other ones that we had come across that we were talking about that were particularly good for the fourth wall kind of thing?
Yeah, that's
Fourth
one.
wall. Oof. I mean, I think that we've covered a lot. I mean, I think
I think
that.
we got all the good ones at
Yeah.
least.
I mean, especially the early ones with Superman, Clark Kent, and
We made it down the board, guys.
went all the way up to the modern ones with like Deadpool, who's, some may say break the fourth wall way too much.
Way too much, yeah. So yeah, thank you very much, everybody, for joining us on our discussion about metafiction. Especially thank you to my special guest, Daniel, for really, like I said, classing it up. He really adds a lot to it. In fact, I would really love to cover a couple of these other topics more in depth. Deconstruction and Easter egg, and even just narrative forms in general and how they are represented in superhero media. I think some of those are really interesting ideas to dig into the history of how just literature itself evolves, and graphic literature, and what it depends on and what it pulls off of. So those are some really cool ideas. We had a lot of fun talking about breaking the fourth wall, and we really appreciate you joining us. So make sure you like and subscribe. Check us out on our YouTube channel at Kaiju Labs Media. And you can also see us every Tuesday live at 7:30. Go to bradsredweb.com and click the Watch Live bar. You can choose whether you want to watch us on Facebook Watch,
Yeah.
or Twitch, or whatever platform you're more comfortable with. And feel free to tell us what you thought about the show. Give us ideas, feedback, and maybe topics you want to hear about or learn about. Maybe something you just find interesting and want us to study. Give us a challenge. And but we really do appreciate you watching, and thank you so much. Thanks again, Greg and Anna, for hosting, our wonderful producer Gavin, and Dragon's Lair Comics and Fantasy for helping us out too. And we'll talk to you all later.